No one had sat beside the Duke of Rothermere in 3 years, and everyone in the ballroom expected that record to continue. The chair beside him stood empty, polished and gleaming under the chandeliers, while mothers steered their daughters wide around it, as though it carried a curse. Gideon Calder, Duke of Rothermere, sat with his spine straight and his face unreadable, watching the dance floor without seeing it. He was used to the empty chair. He had built his life around it. Then Adelaide Merrick walked across the ballroom and sat down beside him. The music did not stop, but it might as well have. Heads turned. Fans paused mid-flutter. A young matron near the punch table gasped loud enough to be heard 3 rows back. Adelaide did not look at any of them. She smoothed her plain gray skirts, folded her hands in her lap, and stared straight ahead at the dancers, as if taking the most feared seat in London was nothing at all. Gideon turned his head slowly. "You are sitting in my chair," he said. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who did not waste words. "It is not your chair," Adelaide replied. "It is simply the chair beside you. No one has claimed it in a long time, so I thought I might." He studied her. She was not young, not by the standards of the room. She had to be nearing 30, unmarried, and by the whispers he'd overheard through the years, quite content to remain so. She wore no jewels, no elaborate feathers in her hair, nothing to draw the eye. And yet she had drawn every eye in the room simply by sitting down. "You know who I am," he said. "Everyone knows who you are, Your Grace. That is rather the point of the empty chair." A muscle in his jaw tightened. Most people who spoke to him did so with trembling voices or overly bright smiles, trying too hard to seem unafraid. Adelaide did neither. She spoke to him the way she might speak to any stranger who happened to occupy the seat next to hers, with polite indifference. "You are not afraid of me," he said. It was not quite a question. Should I be? Most are. Most people, Adelaide said, have something to lose. A husband to catch, a reputation to protect, a mother watching from across the room ready to faint if her daughter says the wrong thing to the wrong man. She turned to look at him directly for the first time, and her eyes were steady, neither cold nor warm, simply honest. "I have none of those things, Your Grace. I stopped being watched years ago. There is nothing left in me for gossip to ruin." Gideon said nothing for a long moment. In 3 years, no one had spoken to him so plainly. No one had dared to imply, even gently, that his reputation was something to be managed rather than feared. "You say that as if it were a comfort," he said finally. "It is not a comfort. It is simply a fact. I have found that facts, once accepted, stop being painful." She glanced toward the dance floor, where a young woman in blue was laughing too loudly at something her partner had said. "Do you dance, Your Grace?" "No. Neither do I anymore. It has been years since anyone asked." "Why not?" Adelaide's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "That is a long story, and this is a short conversation. We have already given the room more to talk about than it has had in months. I should not be greedy." She made to rise, but Gideon spoke before he could stop himself. "Stay." The word surprised him as much as it surprised her. She paused, half risen from the chair, and looked down at him with an expression he could not quite name. Not triumph, not pity, something closer to curiosity, as if she had expected many things from him but not that. She sat back down. Across the room, Lady Sylvia Combe watched the exchange with narrowed eyes over the rim of her glass. Beside her, wound tight in silk and pearls, her daughter Georgiana Combe had gone quite pale. "Who is that woman?" Georgiana asked, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Adelaide Merrick," Lady Sylvia said, "a nobody. Her family had some money once, before her father lost it at cards. She has been sitting in corners at these events for a decade, unnoticed and unmarried. I confess I did not think she had it in her to do something so bold. She is speaking to him as though they are old friends. They are not friends. No one is friends with the Duke of Rothermere." Lady Sylvia's fan snapped shut, but she has done in one evening what half the eligible ladies in London have failed to do in 3 years. She has made him look at her. Georgiana's jaw tightened. She had spent the better part of the season angling for the Duke's attention, not out of any particular affection for him, but because a Duke was a Duke, and Dukes did not remain unmarried forever if their mothers had anything to say about it. The fact that this quiet, forgotten woman had accomplished in a single conversation what Georgiana's careful campaigns had not was, to her, an insult that demanded correction. "She will not last," Georgiana said. "Whatever nonsense she is filling his ear with now, it will not last. Men like him do not choose women like her." "Perhaps not," Lady Sylvia agreed, though her eyes did not leave the pair across the room. "But we should watch her all the same. A woman with nothing to lose is a dangerous thing, Georgiana. She has no reputation to protect. which means she has no reason to behave. Back beside the empty chair that was no longer empty, Gideon found himself, for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, genuinely curious about another person. "You said you do not dance anymore," he said. "Was there someone, once?" Adelaide's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into calm. "There was an understanding, once. It ended badly. I would rather not discuss it at a ball, Your Grace, surrounded by people eager to overhear. Fair enough?" He paused, then added, "You may call me Gideon, if the formality wearies you as much as it wearies me." "I would not dream of it," Adelaide said, though there was the faintest hint of amusement in her voice now. "The whole room is already scandalized that I dared sit beside you. If I began using your Christian name, half the mothers here would faint outright, and I have no wish to be responsible for a room full of fainting women." Despite himself, Gideon felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It had been a long time since anyone had made him want to smile. "You find this amusing," he said. "I find it interesting," Adelaide corrected. "There is a difference. Amusing implies I am laughing at you. I am not. I am simply observing that you are not nearly so terrifying as the rumors suggest." "And what do the rumors suggest?" Something shifted behind her eyes, a careful retreat, as though she had walked closer to a subject than she meant to. "Many things. Most of them exaggerated, I imagine. Most rumors are built on some truth." "Perhaps," Adelaide said, "but truth, once it passes through enough mouths, tends to become something else entirely. I try not to put much faith in what people whisper about others. I have been the subject of enough whispers myself to know how little they resemble the truth." Gideon studied her for a long moment, searching her face for the pity or the fear he had come to expect from every person who dared approach him. He found neither. What he found instead was something rarer and far more unsettling: genuine, unguarded interest, offered without any apparent desire for something in return. "You are an unusual woman, Miss Merrick," he said. "I have been called worse," Adelaide replied. "Spinster, mostly. Odd, forgettable. Unusual is a kindness, by comparison. It was meant as one." The orchestra shifted into a new song, slower this time, and around them, the room continued its familiar rhythm of dancing and gossip, entirely unaware that the two people sitting quietly at its edge had just begun something that would upend both their lives. Neither of them could have said, in that moment, how far the ripples of one empty chair would travel. But across the room, Lady Sylvia Combe was already composing the first of many letters, and in the shadowed corner near the terrace doors, a servant who answered to more than one master was already taking careful note of everything he had seen. The empty seat, it seemed, would not stay empty again. Later that evening, as the ball began to thin and carriages queued along the drive to collect departing guests, Gideon found himself lingering longer than he had in years, reluctant to let the strange, unexpected ease of the evening end. He watched Adelaide across the room, speaking now with an elderly aunt who had clearly not expected to see her niece at the center of any attention, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, a warmth he had trained himself, over 3 long years, not to expect. "You seem in good spirits tonight, Your Grace," remarked Lord Alden, one of the few men in London who still counted himself among Gideon's friends, approaching with 2 glasses of wine. "I confess I do not believe I have seen you linger past midnight since before your sister passed." "Perhaps I have found a reason to linger," Gideon said, accepting the glass without taking his eyes from Adelaide across the room. Alden followed his gaze and smiled slowly. "Miss Merrick. I remember her from years ago, before her family's troubles began. Quiet, thoughtful, always the last to speak and often the wisest when she finally did. I am glad to see society has not managed to extinguish that entirely, however hard it tried." "You knew her before?" "Slightly. My sister was briefly acquainted with her before the family's circumstances changed and invitations grew thinner. It is a shame what happened to them. Her father was a foolish man in his final years, but Miss Merrick herself never did anything to deserve the isolation that followed." Alden studied his friend carefully. "You could do considerably worse, Rothermere, if I may be so bold as to say so." "You may not," Gideon said, though there was no real heat in it, only the faint, unfamiliar shadow of a smile. By the time Adelaide's carriage was called, the ballroom had grown quiet enough that their farewell drew fewer eyes than their earlier conversation had, though Gideon suspected that whatever privacy remained would not last past morning, once the night's events had been thoroughly discussed over breakfast tables across the city. "Thank you," he said, walking her to the door himself, an act of courtesy he had not extended to anyone in longer than he cared to remember, "for the empty chair. It was hardly a gift, Your Grace. merely a seat. It was considerably more than that, Gideon said quietly. I hope you know that. Adelaide studied him for a moment, something thoughtful passing behind her eyes. I hope, in time, you will let me understand exactly how much more. She left him standing at the top of the steps, watching her carriage disappear into the darkened street, and for the first time in 3 years, Gideon found himself looking forward, with something like eagerness, to whatever the following days might bring. 3 days later, invitations to a garden breakfast at the Merrick residence arrived across half of fashionable London, an event that would have gone entirely unremarked had it not included, to the shock of every recipient, the name of the Duke of Rothermere among the guests. Adelaide's brother, Peter Merrick, had been the one to extend the invitation, more out of curiosity than any real understanding of what he was setting in motion. He had heard, second-hand and much embellished, of his sister's conversation with the Duke at the ball, and he assumed, as most brothers might, that it had been a passing pleasantry, nothing more. He did not expect the Duke to accept. You actually wrote back, Adelaide said, staring at the reply in her brother's hand, as though it might transform into something else if she looked at it long enough. I did not think he would, Peter admitted. I only sent the invitation because you mentioned speaking with him, and I thought it would be rude not to. Dukes do not usually bother replying to breakfasts hosted by families as unremarkable as ours. We are not unremarkable, Adelaide said, though there was little conviction in it. Their family had once held a respectable place in society, before their father's gambling had quietly stripped away both fortune and standing, leaving them with a modest house, a diminished income, and a reputation that had faded rather than shattered. It was, Adelaide often thought, a slow and unglamorous sort of ruin, the kind that did not make for interesting gossip, only for pity, which was somehow worse. He is coming on Thursday, Peter said. You should probably prepare yourself for the entire street to be watching from behind their curtains. Adelaide sighed and folded the letter closed. I did not intend for any of this. Sitting beside the most feared man in London rarely leads to a quiet outcome, Addie. She could not argue with that. Thursday arrived with a soft gray sky and a garden full of roses just beginning to wilt at the edges, the kind of late summer morning that suggested the season was drawing toward its close. Adelaide had dressed carefully, though she told herself it did not matter, that there was no reason to impress a man who had already seen her at her plainest and had chosen to speak to her anyway. Gideon arrived precisely on time, dressed with the same austere elegance he wore to every event, and was shown into the garden by a housemaid who could not quite hide her astonishment at having a duke cross her threshold. You came, Adelaide said, rising from the bench where she had been waiting. I said I would. Dukes rarely follow through on invitations extended by families such as mine. I am not most dukes, Gideon said, and there was something almost dry in his tone, an attempt at humor that sat awkwardly on a man so unused to using it. They walked the garden path together, trailed at a respectful distance by Peter, who had appointed himself an unofficial chaperone, and clearly had no intention of leaving his sister entirely alone, with a man of such formidable reputation, however calm the man himself appeared. I confess, Gideon said, that I have thought of our conversation more than once since the ball. That surprises me. Why? Because I imagine a man in your position has a great many demands on his attention. A single conversation with an unremarkable woman hardly seems worth remembering. You are not unremarkable, Gideon said, and the words came out more firmly than he intended. You are the only person who has spoken to me honestly in years. Everyone else measures their words as though I might strike them for the wrong ones. Adelaide glanced at him sideways. And do you? Strike people for the wrong words? No, but the rumors suggest I might, and rumors, once believed, are difficult to dislodge. I told you, I do not put much faith in rumors. So you said. Gideon paused beside a rose bush, running his fingers absently over a browning petal. May I ask you something, Miss Merrick? You may ask. I cannot promise an answer. Why did you sit beside me? Truly, not the answer you gave at the ball, about having nothing to lose. The real reason. Adelaide was quiet for a moment, watching a bee move lazily between the flowers. I have spent 10 years watching people avoid me, she said finally. Not out of fear, the way they avoid you, but out of indifference. I stopped being interesting to society the moment my father's debts became known. I am invited places out of obligation, seated at the edges of rooms, spoken to only when politeness demands it. I know what it is to be avoided, Your Grace, even if the reasons differ from yours. She looked up at him. When I saw that empty chair, I did not think of it as brave. I thought of it as familiar. I understood, in some small way, what it must feel like to sit in a room full of people who refuse to look at you. Gideon's expression, usually so carefully composed, softened into something unguarded. I did not expect that answer. Most people do not expect honesty. That is rather the problem with most people. They continued walking, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained, until Gideon spoke again, his voice quieter now. There was a tragedy, some years ago. I imagine you have heard some version of it. I have heard several versions, Adelaide admitted. I do not know which, if any, are true. I am not ready to tell you which, Gideon said. Not yet, but I would rather you hear it from me, eventually, than continue to hear it from people who were not there. I can wait, Adelaide said simply. I am good at waiting. I have had a great deal of practice. Behind them, unnoticed, Peter Merrick watched the exchange with a growing sense that his sister's quiet, unremarkable life was about to change in ways neither of them could yet predict. He did not know, as he watched the Duke of Rothermere walk beside his sister among the fading roses, that letters were already being drafted across town, letters designed to ensure that whatever was beginning in this garden would not be allowed to continue in peace. Lady Sylvia Combe did not believe in leaving matters to chance, and she had already decided that Adelaide Merrick needed to be reminded of her place. A fortnight after the garden breakfast, Gideon called upon the Merrick household with an invitation that surprised even Peter, who by now had grown accustomed to his sister's unlikely visitor. A small gathering at Rothermere House itself, intimate enough that Adelaide would see, for the first time, the private world Gideon rarely allowed anyone to enter. She arrived to find the house grand but quiet, its halls lined with portraits of ancestors who watched her pass with painted, impassive eyes. Yardley greeted her personally at the door, his manner warmer than she expected from a household staff so accustomed to isolation. His Grace is in the library, Miss Merrick, Yardley said, leading her through corridors that echoed faintly with each footstep. He asked that I bring you to him directly, rather than announce you formally. I believe he wished to avoid ceremony. The library, when she reached it, was vast and dim, lined floor to ceiling with books that spoke of generations of careful collection. Gideon stood near the window, a single lamp burning low on the desk beside him, and turned at the sound of her entrance with an expression of quiet relief, as though he had feared, despite the invitation, that she might not come. You did not need to bring me here alone, Adelaide said, glancing around the empty room. It is hardly proper. I am aware, Gideon admitted, but I find I have grown tired of only ever seeing you surrounded by people determined to overhear every word we exchange. I wished, for once, to speak with you without an audience. Adelaide moved closer, studying the shelves with genuine curiosity. This is a remarkable collection. My father began it. I have added to it over the years, mostly during periods when I found company unbearable and books considerably easier to tolerate. Gideon's voice held a rare note of self-deprecating humor. I confess I have spent more evenings in this room than in any ballroom London has to offer, these past 3 years. It does not surprise me, Adelaide said gently. Grief has a way of making solitude feel safer than company. You speak as though you understand that feeling well. I do. She traced a finger along the spine of a worn volume of poetry, not quite meeting his eyes. After my father's death and the ruin that followed, I spent nearly 2 years refusing every invitation extended to me, convinced that the pity in every room would be more painful than the isolation. It took my brother a great deal of patience to coax me back into society at all, and even then, I never fully returned. I simply learned to occupy its edges without truly belonging to it. And now? Now I find myself standing in a duke's library, invited here by a man everyone else fears, feeling more like myself than I have in a decade. She looked up at him then, something open and unguarded in her expression. I do not entirely know what to make of that. Gideon crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the careful restraint in his eyes, the effort it cost him to maintain the distance propriety demanded. I find myself in a similar position, Miss Merrick. I had resigned myself, after Rosamond's death, to a life lived at arm's length from everyone around me. I told myself it was safer that way, that closeness only ever invited loss. I did not expect a woman I met over an empty chair to unravel 3 years of careful isolation in the span of a few conversations. Do you regret it? No, Gideon said, without hesitation. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I do not regret it at all. They stood together in the quiet of the library for a long moment, the lamp casting soft shadows across the rows of books, and though nothing more was said, something had settled between them, a fragile understanding neither of them was yet ready to name aloud, but both of them recognized all the same. It was Yardley's discreet knock, some time later, that finally broke the stillness. announcing that the other guests had begun to arrive for the evening's small gathering, and the moment, private and unrepeatable, drew gently to its close. But Adelaide carried it with her long after she left Rothermere House that night, a quiet certainty settling into place beside the fear she had not yet fully released, that whatever waited for them beyond the library's walls, she no longer wished to face it without him. Lady Sylvia Combs' letters worked with a quiet, patient poison, the kind that did not announce itself but spread all the same. Within a week, whispers began circulating through the drawing rooms of London that Adelaide Merrick had set her sights on the Duke of Rothermere, not out of any genuine regard, but out of desperation. A spinster's last grasping attempt to secure a title, before her prospects vanished entirely. Adelaide heard the whispers secondhand, the way one always hears such things, filtered through the careful phrasing of friends who did not want to wound her but felt obligated to warn her. "They are saying you pursued him," said Iris Bellamy, the closest thing Adelaide had to a true friend in London, as the two women sat together over tea in Iris's modest parlor, "that you engineered the entire encounter at the ball, that you knew exactly where he would be sitting." "That is absurd," Adelaide said. "I did not even know he would attend." "I know that, you know that. But knowing the truth has never stopped a rumor from spreading, Adelaide. You know this better than anyone." Adelaide set down her cup with more force than she intended. She did know it, better than anyone. She had spent a decade watching her family's reputation crumble under the weight of whispers, half of them exaggerated, some of them entirely false, all of them impossible to correct once they had taken root. She had told herself she no longer cared what people said of her. She was discovering, uncomfortably, that this had never been entirely true. "What do they say of him?" she asked. "The Duke." Iris hesitated, which was answer enough. "Tell me," Adelaide pressed. "They say you are trying to catch a man everyone knows is unfit for marriage. Some say worse. They bring up the old tragedy, the one from years ago, and suggest you either do not know the truth of it or do not care, so long as you secure the title." "What tragedy?" Adelaide asked. "I have heard it mentioned but never explained." Iris glanced toward the door, as though the walls themselves might be listening, then lowered her voice. 3 years ago, his younger sister died, Lady Rosamond. There are 2 stories about how it happened. One says it was illness, sudden and tragic, nothing more. The other says the Duke was somehow responsible, that he failed to protect her from something, though no one seems entirely certain what. The second story is the one that stuck. It is the reason people fear him now. Before it happened, he was simply a duke, respected, unremarkable in his reputation. After, he became something else entirely in the eyes of society. Cold, dangerous, a man to be avoided. Adelaide sat with this information for a long moment, turning it over in her mind. She thought of Gideon in the garden, the careful way he had spoken of the tragedy without naming it, the request that she wait for the truth rather than accept the version offered by strangers. "I do not believe he is dangerous," Adelaide said quietly. "I did not think you did," Iris said. "But belief is not armor, Adelaide. If you continue down this path, the whispers will only grow louder. You have little reputation left to lose, it is true, but you are not entirely without one. And there are people in this city who would be glad to see you lose what remains of it, simply to prove a point. What point would that be? That women like you do not get to reach for men like him," Iris said gently. "It is unkind and unfair, but it is the truth of how this world works, and you know it as well as I do." Adelaide looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and thought of the empty chair, and the strange, unexpected comfort she had found sitting beside a man everyone else feared. She thought of his voice, low and careful, admitting there was a tragedy he was not yet ready to explain. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the garden, as though she were the first honest thing he had encountered in years. "I do not intend to stop seeing him," Adelaide said. "Whatever the whispers say." Iris studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you had better be prepared for what is coming. Lady Sylvia Combe does not simply spread rumors and walk away satisfied. She will not rest until either you are disgraced or the Duke is turned against you. I have known her many years, Adelaide, and I have never once seen her lose a fight she chose to begin." Across town, in the grand, echoing rooms of Rothermere House, Gideon sat alone with a letter he had received that morning, one among several that had begun arriving with unusual frequency since the ball. This one, unsigned but clearly composed by a hand accustomed to elegant cruelty, warned him gently, almost sweetly, that Miss Merrick's family had a history of poor judgment, that her father's debts had nearly ruined them, and that a woman raised in such circumstances could hardly be trusted to have honorable motives in seeking his attention. Gideon read the letter twice, then set it aside with the same calm he applied to most things, though something beneath that calm had tightened uncomfortably. His valet and closest confidant, a steady, older man named Mr. Yardley who had served the Rothermere household since before the tragedy that had changed everything, entered quietly with a fresh pot of tea, and found his employer staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into something less troubling. "Bad news, Your Grace?" "Malicious news," Gideon corrected, "which is worse, in its way. Bad news is simply unfortunate. Malicious news is designed to wound. May I ask who sent it?" "It is unsigned, but I have my suspicions. Lady Sylvia Combe has never forgiven me for failing to show sufficient interest in her daughter this season, and I imagine she has decided that if she cannot secure me for Georgiana, she will at least ensure I do not find happiness elsewhere." Yardley set down the tea tray with the careful precision of a man who had spent decades managing a household through difficult years. "If I may say, Your Grace, you have seemed different since the ball. Lighter, somehow. I have not seen you smile so often in a very long time. I did not realize my staff kept such close count of my smiles. When there have been so few to count, Your Grace, it is difficult not to notice when the number begins to grow." Gideon looked up at the old man, and something in his chest, some old and familiar weight, eased slightly. "She is unlike anyone I have met, Yardley. She does not flinch from me. She does not treat me as though I might shatter at the wrong word, nor as though I might strike out at the slightest provocation. She simply speaks to me, honestly, as though I were an ordinary man. Perhaps, Your Grace, that is precisely what you have needed for some time." "Perhaps." Gideon glanced again at the letter on the table. "But I fear that whatever is beginning between us will not be allowed to continue without a fight. Lady Sylvia is not a woman who accepts defeat quietly, and I suspect this letter is only the beginning of what she intends." "Will you tell Miss Merrick about the letters?" Gideon considered this for a long moment. "Not yet. She has enough to contend with, without adding my enemies to her burden. But I will not let Lady Sylvia's schemes go unanswered forever. There will come a point where I must act, and when that point arrives, I intend to be ready." He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens below, gardens that had once belonged to his sister, who had loved roses the way some people loved music, entirely and without restraint. He thought of Rosamond often, though he spoke of her to almost no one. He thought of the promise he had made himself after her death, that he would never again allow himself to grow close enough to anyone, that their loss could break him the way hers had. And yet here he was, 3 years later, sitting in gardens with a quiet spinster who spoke to him, as though he were simply a man, breaking that promise one conversation at a time. He was not certain, standing at the window with the fading afternoon light falling across his sister's untended roses, whether he regretted it. The following week brought a summons Adelaide had not expected, an invitation to attend the theater as part of a small gathering hosted by one of Gideon's few remaining friends, a gathering that would place her, for the first time, directly within the circle of society that had spent the past fortnight whispering about her. She dressed with more care than she had allowed herself in years, choosing a deep blue gown that had once belonged to better days, before her father's debts had forced economies on every corner of the household. Peter watched her prepare with an expression caught somewhere between pride and worry. "You do not have to go, Addie," he said, "if the whispers trouble you as much as I suspect they do. I am not going to hide, Peter. I have spent 10 years hiding at the edges of rooms, hoping no one would notice me. I find, rather to my surprise, that I no longer wish to." The theater was crowded and bright, filled with the particular energy of a society eager for spectacle, and Adelaide felt every eye turned toward her the moment she entered the box beside Gideon. Whispers rippled through the surrounding seats, quiet but unmistakable, and she forced herself to keep her chin high, her expression calm, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of seeing her falter. "You look as though you are walking into battle," Gideon murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear. "I feel rather as though I am," Adelaide admitted. "You need not fear them." "I do not fear them," she said. "I simply dislike being discussed as though I were not present to hear it." Across the theater, in a box positioned with deliberate care to observe rather than be observed, Lady Sylvia Combe watched the pair settle into their seats with an expression of cool satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for precisely this moment. "There," she murmured to Georgiana, who sat beside her in stiff, unhappy silence. "Now the whole of society has seen them together in public, beyond the privacy of a garden. It will be easier now to plant the seeds of doubt where they will grow fastest. What do you intend to do, Mother?" Nothing so crude as an open accusation. That would only make her a martyr, and martyrs are tediously difficult to destroy. No, we will simply ensure that certain facts about her family's past find their way into the right ears, and certain questions about the Duke's past find their way into hers. Doubt, once planted, tends to grow on its own, without any further tending required. Georgiana's mouth tightened into something that was not quite a smile. And if it does not work, if they simply grow closer despite everything? Then we will find another way, Lady Sylvia said, her voice as calm and pleasant as if she were discussing the weather. I did not raise you to accept defeat gracefully, Georgiana, and I certainly do not intend to accept it myself. The Duke of Rothermere is worth a great deal more than his coldness suggests, and I do not intend to watch that fortune and that title settle on a family as unremarkable as the Merricks without a fight. Down in the box below, unaware of the conversation unfolding above them, Adelaide leaned toward Gideon as the curtain began to rise. Whatever happens tonight, she said quietly, whatever they say about us afterward, I do not regret coming. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing behind his eyes. Nor do I, he said. Whatever comes next, Miss Merrick, I find that I would rather face it beside you than alone. Neither of them could have known, as the curtain rose and the theater fell into hushed anticipation, that Lady Sylvia Combe had already set her plans into motion, plans that would soon threaten to tear apart everything they were only just beginning to build. In the days that followed the theater, Adelaide found herself invited, for the first time in years, to gatherings she would once have been quietly excluded from. Society, it seemed, could not decide whether to condemn her or study her, and in its confusion it chose, for the moment, to simply watch. She bore the scrutiny with more composure than she felt. At a musical evening hosted by a countess she barely knew, she found herself seated near a cluster of matrons who fell abruptly silent the moment she approached, then resumed their conversation in tones just loud enough to be overheard. They say she practically threw herself into the chair beside him, one woman murmured, quite calculated, for a woman who has spent a decade pretending not to want a husband at all. Perhaps she grew tired of pretending, said another, with less unkindness than the first. Adelaide took her seat nearby without acknowledging she had heard, though her hands, folded neatly in her lap, betrayed a slight tightness that had not been there a month earlier. She had told herself, so many times, that she no longer cared for the good opinion of rooms like this one. She was learning, uncomfortably, that caring for one person's opinion had somehow reopened her heart to caring, faintly, about everyone else's as well. Gideon found her there before the music began, and something in his face, some quiet understanding, told her he had heard the same whispers she had. You need not stay, he said, low enough for only her to hear. We could leave, if you wished it. And give them the satisfaction of believing they had driven me out? Adelaide shook her head. No. I have spent too many years leaving rooms quietly. I find I would rather stay and let them grow accustomed to the sight of me. He looked at her with something like admiration, and took the seat beside her without hesitation, in full view of the matrons who had been whispering only moments before. Their conversation stopped entirely. It was a small victory, hardly worth remarking upon to anyone who had not spent a decade learning to expect nothing better, but Adelaide felt it settle warmly in her chest all the same. A small proof that the ground beneath her was, however slowly, beginning to shift in her favor. Not everyone shared in that shift. Lady Sylvia Combe, seated several rows back with an expression of serene, watchful patience, observed the exchange with the particular attention of a woman recalculating her strategy. She had hoped the theater outing might invite scandal enough to do her work for her. Instead, it seemed to have done the opposite, drawing sympathy toward the pair rather than suspicion. They are growing bolder, she murmured to Georgiana afterward, as their carriage rattled home through darkened streets. Public appearances will not be enough to unseat her, it seems. We must find something closer to the truth, something that cannot be so easily dismissed as jealous gossip. What did you have in mind, Mother? Lady Sylvia's gaze drifted toward the window, calculating. Her father's debts. I have made inquiries already, and I believe there is more to that story than the family has ever admitted. If there is even a thread of genuine scandal buried in her past, I intend to find it, and I intend to make certain the entire ton hears of it before the season draws to its close. Georgiana said nothing, though a small, uneasy knot had begun to form in her chest, one she did not yet have the courage to name as guilt. The accusation came not as a whisper but as a spectacle, delivered in the middle of a garden party hosted by one of the season's most prominent hostesses, in front of enough witnesses to ensure the story would travel through every drawing room in London by morning. Adelaide had arrived expecting an ordinary afternoon of polite conversation and careful smiles, the kind of gathering she had endured 100 times before without incident. She did not expect Georgiana Combe to approach her directly, flanked by two friends who seemed to have been positioned deliberately as an audience. Nor did she expect the venom in Georgiana's voice when she spoke. "I wonder, Miss Merrick," Georgiana said, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear, "whether you have told the Duke the full truth about your father's debts. I understand there were certain irregularities, certain suggestions that money went missing under circumstances rather more troubling than simple bad luck at cards." The garden went quiet around them. Adelaide felt her face go pale, then hot, as every eye within earshot turned toward her. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the sudden fear beneath her composure. "Do you not?" Georgiana's smile was thin and sharp. "How curious. I had heard, from a source I trust entirely, that your father did not simply lose money at cards, as everyone has been led to believe, but that he borrowed against debts he had no intention of repaying, leaving several respectable families considerably poorer for having trusted him. I wonder if the Duke knows this. I wonder if he would still find you so charming, sitting beside him at balls, if he understood the full extent of what your family truly is." Adelaide's hands had begun to tremble, though she kept them clasped tightly at her waist, refusing to let the tremor show. The accusation was cruel, and worse, it contained just enough truth twisted into something unrecognizable to make denial difficult. Her father had, indeed, left several debts unpaid at his death, debts her family had spent years quietly settling, but the suggestion of deliberate deception, of intentional fraud, was a lie, one designed specifically to wound. "Whatever you have heard," Adelaide said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "is not the truth. My father made mistakes. He was not a dishonest man." "That is not what I have heard," Georgiana said, her voice carrying easily across the hushed garden. "But then, I suppose you would say that, wouldn't you? It would hardly serve your purposes to admit the truth now, not when you have worked so hard to secure a duke's attention despite everything your family has done." Adelaide opened her mouth to respond, but found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that words had entirely deserted her. The garden felt suddenly too warm, too crowded. Every face turned toward her with expressions ranging from pity to open curiosity, as though she were a performance rather than a person. It was Gideon's voice, arriving from somewhere behind her, that broke the terrible silence. "That is quite enough, Miss Combe." He stepped forward, positioning himself beside Adelaide with a calm that did nothing to disguise the cold fury beneath it. The garden, already silent, seemed to still further at the sound of his voice. "Your Grace," Georgiana began, her earlier confidence faltering slightly. "I only meant to—" "I know precisely what you meant to do," Gideon said. "You meant to humiliate Miss Merrick in front of as many witnesses as possible, in the hope that the damage would be irreversible before the truth could catch up to your accusations. It is a common enough strategy, Miss Combe, though I confess I expected more subtlety from your mother, given her reputation for careful scheming." Georgiana's face flushed, and around them, the assembled guests exchanged glances, sensing that the spectacle they had come to witness had taken an unexpected turn. "Miss Merrick's father made mistakes," Gideon continued, his voice carrying clearly across the garden, "as do most men who gamble beyond their means. But the suggestion that he committed deliberate fraud is a fabrication, one I suspect originated with your mother, who has taken a particular and rather transparent interest in ensuring Miss Merrick and I do not continue to enjoy each other's company." "That is a serious accusation, Your Grace," Georgiana said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier venom. "It is," Gideon agreed, "and I intend to investigate it fully. If I discover that you or your mother have been spreading deliberate falsehoods about Miss Merrick's family, I will ensure that the consequences reach considerably further than a garden party's worth of gossip." Georgiana's mouth opened, then closed again, and for a moment she looked less like a scheming rival, and more like a young woman suddenly aware that she had overreached badly. She turned, without another word, and retreated through the crowd, her earlier confidence entirely dissolved. Adelaide, still trembling slightly, turned to Gideon with an expression somewhere between gratitude and mortification. "You did not need to defend me so publicly." "I did," Gideon said simply. "I would not have you stand alone against that kind of cruelty, not when I have the power to prevent it." "They will only whisper louder now, about both of us." "Let them whisper," Gideon said. "I have endured 3 years of whispers, Miss Merrick. I find I no longer have any patience for allowing them to dictate how I live my life, or who I choose to stand beside. But even as he spoke the words, Adelaide could see something troubled behind his eyes, some old wound reopened by the confrontation, and she understood, with sudden clarity, that the tragedy he had promised to explain to her someday was closer to the surface now than either of them had intended. That evening, in the quiet of Rothermere House, Gideon finally told her. They sat together in his private study, a room Adelaide had not expected to be invited into, surrounded by shelves of books and the lingering scent of old paper and firewood. Gideon poured 2 glasses of sherry, though neither of them touched their drink, and for a long moment he simply stared into the fire, gathering the courage for words he had not spoken aloud in 3 years. My sister's name was Rosamond, he said finally. She was 7 years younger than me, and she was, by every measure, the better half of our family. Where I was reserved and often distant, she was warm, generous, quick to laugh. Our parents died when she was young, and I raised her, in many ways, as much as any older brother could raise a sister. I loved her more than I have ever loved anyone. Adelaide said nothing, sensing that he needed to continue without interruption. 3 years ago she fell ill. It was sudden, and it progressed faster than any physician could account for. I called in every doctor London had to offer, spent a fortune on treatments that did nothing, and in the end, I could not save her. His voice had gone rough, quiet. There are those who say I did not act quickly enough, that I delayed calling for proper help because I did not want to believe how serious her illness truly was. There are others who suggest darker things entirely, that I somehow contributed to her death through neglect or worse. Is any of it true? Adelaide asked gently. The delay? Yes, in part. I did not want to believe she was truly dying, and I wasted precious days convincing myself it was merely a passing fever. By the time I accepted the truth and called for the finest physicians in England, it was already too late. I have spent 3 years believing that if I had simply acted sooner, she might still be alive. He looked up at Adelaide, his eyes rimmed with an old, unhealed grief. The rest, the suggestion that I did something worse, that I was somehow responsible beyond simple delay, is entirely false. But false stories, once they take root, are difficult to kill, and I found it easier, after her death, to simply withdraw from society entirely, rather than fight against rumors I could not fully disprove. Adelaide reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers cool against his. That is not the same as guilt, Gideon. Grief and delay are not the same as cruelty. You loved her. Anyone listening to you speak of her now would know that instantly. I have not spoken of her to anyone in 3 years, Gideon said quietly. Not truly. Not like this. Then I am glad you have spoken of her to me. They sat together in silence for a long moment, his hand still held in hers, the fire crackling softly in the grate. Outside, London continued its endless churn of gossip and scheming, but within the quiet walls of the study, something had shifted between them. Something deeper and more fragile than either of them had expected to find. Lady Sylvia will not stop, Gideon said eventually. Tonight was only the beginning of what she intends. I know, Adelaide said, but I find, rather to my own surprise, that I am no longer afraid of what she might do. Why not? Adelaide considered the question carefully before answering. Because I have already survived the worst that whispers can do to a person, Gideon. I have lived at the edges of society for a decade, watching people avoid me, pity me, forget me entirely. Whatever Lady Sylvia intends, I do not think it can hurt me more than that silence already did. She squeezed his hand gently. And this time, at least, I do not have to face it alone. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring behind his careful composure, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps happiness was not something permanently beyond his reach. The forged letter arrived at Adelaide's home on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy who could not say who had sent him, only that he had been paid a coin to place it directly into her hands. Adelaide broke the seal expecting correspondence from Iris, or perhaps a note from Gideon, and found instead a letter written in a hand meant to imitate his, containing words that made her blood run cold before the coldness gave way to a deep, aching hurt. The letter claimed, in careful and convincing script, that Gideon had grown weary of the scandal her presence had brought upon him, that he regretted ever allowing their acquaintance to progress beyond the ballroom, and that he intended to end all contact between them before the damage to his family name became irreversible. It suggested, with cruel precision, that his kindness toward her had always been motivated by pity rather than genuine regard, and that he had spoken of her, privately, as a burden he was eager to set down. Adelaide read the letter 3 times before she allowed herself to cry. She did not know, sitting alone in her small parlor with the forged words clutched in trembling hands, that the letter had been commissioned by Lady Sylvia Combe and executed by a man named Nolan Fitch, a struggling clerk with a talent for mimicking handwriting and considerably fewer scruples than his profession required. She did not know that Gideon had written no such letter, had expressed no such sentiments, and remained, at that very moment, entirely unaware that his name had been used to wound the woman he had begun to love. All Adelaide knew was the pain of believing herself abandoned, and the terrible, familiar sensation of being once again unwanted by someone she had allowed herself to trust. She did not respond to Gideon's next invitation. She did not answer his letters, which grew increasingly concerned as her silence stretched from one day into several. She told herself she was protecting what remained of her dignity, refusing to chase after a man who had already decided she was not worth the scandal she had brought him. It was Iris who finally forced the truth into the open, arriving unannounced at the Merrick household nearly a week after the forged letter had arrived, having heard through her own network of acquaintances that something had gone terribly wrong between Adelaide and the Duke. "You look dreadful," Iris said bluntly, settling herself into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "What has happened?" Adelaide, who had not slept properly in days, handed over the letter without a word. Iris read it carefully, her expression shifting from confusion to something sharper, more suspicious, as she reached the final lines. "This does not sound like him." "It is in his hand," Adelaide said miserably, "or close enough to it that I could not tell the difference." "Adelaide," Iris set the letter down with deliberate care. "I have seen the Duke's handwriting before, on correspondence sent to my husband regarding matters of business. This is close, I will grant you, but it is not identical. Look here, at the way the letters lean. And this signature is too careful, too deliberate. A man writing in genuine haste, ending something he has agonized over, does not sign his name with such perfect precision." Adelaide stared at the letter with new eyes, hope and fear warring uncomfortably in her chest. "You think it is forged?" "I think," Iris said slowly, "that this bears all the hallmarks of Lady Sylvia Combe's particular brand of cruelty. She has done this before, to other women who threatened her plans. I did not think to warn you, because I did not believe she would go quite so far, but I see now that I underestimated her considerably." "If it is forged," Adelaide said, her voice shaking, "then Gideon does not know why I have refused his letters. He must believe I have simply abandoned him, without explanation, exactly as everyone predicted a woman like me eventually would." "Then you must go to him," Iris said, "immediately, before this misunderstanding is allowed to fester any longer." Adelaide did not need to be told twice. She arrived at Rothermere House with her hair still disheveled from the hasty journey, the forged letter clutched in her hand, and found Gideon in his study, staring into a cold fireplace with an expression of such profound weariness that it broke something in her chest to see it. "Adelaide," he said, rising quickly when Yardley showed her in, surprise and something more fragile flickering across his face. "I did not expect, I had begun to think you no longer wished to see me." "I received this," she said, holding out the letter, "a week ago. I believed it came from you." Gideon took the letter with visible confusion, reading it quickly, his expression darkening with each line until, by the end, his hands had begun to tremble with barely restrained anger. "I did not write this. Adelaide, I swear to you, I did not write a single word of this." "I believe you," she said. Iris recognized the forgery. "I only wish I had trusted my own instincts sooner, rather than assuming the worst of you so easily." "You had every reason to believe it," Gideon said. "The handwriting is remarkably close to my own. Someone has studied my correspondence carefully to achieve this." He set the letter down with visible restraint, as though he wished to tear it apart, but understood the value of preserving it as evidence. "This is Lady Sylvia's doing. I am certain of it. I believe so as well. I will not let this stand," Gideon said, his voice low and hard. "She has attacked your family's reputation, and now she has attempted to destroy the trust between us through outright forgery. This goes beyond ordinary scheming, Adelaide. This is deliberate, calculated cruelty, and I intend to expose it publicly." "How?" "Nolan Fitch," Gideon said. "I have suspected for some time that Lady Sylvia employs him for tasks she wishes to keep at a distance from her own hands. If he composed this letter, there will be evidence of the commission somewhere, payment records, correspondence, something that connects the forgery directly back to her. And if you find that evidence, then I will bring it before enough witnesses that Lady Sylvia Combe will find her own reputation considerably more damaged than the one she attempted to ruin." Adelaide reached for his hand, and this time it was Gideon who held on with quiet desperation, as though reassuring himself that she was truly there, truly real, and not another cruelty about to be snatched away. "I am sorry," she said, "for doubting you, even for a week. You had no reason to trust a letter over your own instincts, given how carefully it was crafted," Gideon said. "The fault lies entirely with the person who wrote it, not with you for believing it. But Adelaide, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Anything. Do you love me, truly, beyond the scandal and the whispers and everything this city has tried to place between us?" Adelaide did not hesitate. "Yes, I have loved you, I think, since that first evening at the ball, though I did not understand it then for what it was. I only knew that, for the first time in years, someone looked at me as though I mattered." "Then let us finish this together," Gideon said. "Let us expose Lady Sylvia's schemes once and for all, and let us do it in a way that leaves no doubt, to anyone, of what we mean to each other." Finding Nolan Fitch proved easier than Gideon expected, and far more difficult than he had hoped. Yardley, through a network of quiet inquiries among the city's clerks and copyists, traced the man to a cramped set of rooms above a stationer's shop near Fleet Street, where he earned a modest living copying documents for lawyers too busy to write out their own correspondence. Gideon went to him directly, without warning, choosing an hour when the shop below would be empty of customers. Fitch answered the door himself, a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and the wary eyes of someone accustomed to trouble finding him eventually. "Your Grace." Fitch's voice cracked slightly on the title. "I did not expect. That is, I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not," Gideon said, stepping past him into the small, cluttered room without waiting for an invitation. "But I believe you are familiar with my handwriting all the same, Mr. Fitch. Familiar enough to have reproduced it rather convincingly on a letter I never wrote." The color drained from Fitch's face. He opened his mouth, some protest half-formed, then seemed to think better of it, sinking instead into the single chair beside his writing desk, as though his legs could no longer hold him. "I did not wish to do it," he said quietly. "I want you to understand that, Your Grace, whatever else you believe of me. Lady Sylvia Combe came to me some months ago with copying work, ordinary correspondence at first, nothing objectionable. It paid well, better than my usual clients, and I did not ask many questions about why a woman of her standing required a clerk's services rather than her own household secretary. By the time she asked me to imitate your hand, I had already grown dependent on the income, and I did not feel I could refuse without losing it entirely." "That is not an excuse," Gideon said, though his voice held less anger than weariness. "You understood, surely, that the letter was designed to wound someone." "I understood," Fitch admitted, shame coloring his voice. "I told myself it was only a small cruelty, a private matter between people of a class I would never encounter directly. I did not think of the woman who would receive it, only of the coin I would be paid for producing it." He looked up at Gideon with something like desperate hope. "I have a wife, Your Grace, and 2 children. I have made a grave error, and I do not ask you to forgive it, only to understand that I did not act from malice, only from need." Gideon studied him for a long moment, weighing the man's evident remorse against the damage his forgery had caused. "I am not interested in ruining you, Mr. Fitch, though I have every right to. What I want is the truth, set down in your own hand and signed, along with any record of payment you received from Lady Sylvia Combe. Give me that, honestly and completely, and I will see that no charges follow you. Refuse, and I will pursue this matter through whatever legal means remain available to me, regardless of the cost to your family." Fitch did not hesitate long. Within the hour, he had produced not only a signed confession but a small ledger, kept out of habit rather than any expectation it would ever be needed as evidence, recording each payment received from Lady Sylvia Combe over the preceding months, along with brief notations of the work each payment had purchased. The forged letter was listed plainly among them, dated precisely to the week it had arrived at Adelaide's door. Gideon left the cramped rooms above the stationer's shop with the evidence secured carefully inside his coat, and something that might have been pity, mixed uneasily with lingering anger, settled over him as he walked back toward his waiting carriage. He thought of Fitch's frightened wife, of the children he had mentioned, and understood, with the particular clarity that came from his own years of hardship, how easily desperation could be turned into a weapon by those with enough money and cruelty to wield it. It did nothing to soften his resolve. If anything, it hardened it further. Lady Sylvia Combe had not only attacked Adelaide directly, she had preyed upon a struggling man's poverty to do it, and Gideon intended to ensure that such calculated cruelty would not go unanswered. Adelaide spent the days before the ball in a state of restless anticipation, torn between hope for what Gideon's evidence might accomplish, and a lingering, quiet fear that Lady Sylvia would find some way to twist even proven truth into further scandal against her. "You are pacing," Peter observed one evening, watching his sister cross the small parlor for perhaps the 10th time in an hour. "You will wear a path through the carpet if you continue." "I cannot help it," Adelaide admitted, sinking finally into a chair. "So much depends on what happens at that ball. If Gideon's confrontation fails, if Lady Sylvia manages to twist the evidence against us somehow, I do not know how we recover from it." "You have already recovered from a great deal, Addie," Peter said gently. "You survived father's ruin. You survived a decade of being overlooked. I do not think a woman capable of enduring that has anything left to fear from Lady Sylvia Combe, whatever schemes she still has left to try." Adelaide managed a small, grateful smile. "When did you become so wise, little brother?" "I have simply been watching you closely these past months," Peter said. "You have taught me a great deal about courage, Addie, without ever intending to. I only hope I can return the favor when you need it most." That night, unable to sleep, Adelaide sat by her window and thought of the empty chair, of the moment she had chosen to sit down beside a man the whole of London feared. She had told herself, at the time, that she had nothing left to lose. She understood now, staring out at the darkened street below, how much that had changed. She had a great deal to lose now, a future she had never allowed herself to imagine, a love she had not expected to find at nearly 30 years of age, after a decade of careful, protective indifference. She was no longer the woman who sat down because she had nothing to protect. She was a woman determined to protect everything she had built, however new and fragile it still remained. The confrontation came at a ball hosted by one of society's most prominent families, an event large enough to guarantee the widest possible audience for whatever unfolded. Gideon had spent the intervening days gathering evidence, and Yardley, through careful and patient inquiry, had confirmed that Nolan Fitch had indeed received payment from Lady Sylvia Combe for services rendered. Services the clerk, once confronted privately and offered protection from prosecution in exchange for honesty, had confessed to in humiliating detail. Gideon waited until the ballroom was at its fullest, until Lady Sylvia stood near the center of the room holding court among a circle of admirers, before he approached with Adelaide at his side and the evidence in hand. "Lady Sylvia," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, silencing the surrounding conversations, "I wonder if you might explain why you commissioned a forged letter in my hand, designed to convince Miss Merrick that I had abandoned her." The color drained from Lady Sylvia's face, though she recovered quickly, her composure a well-practiced mask. "I have no idea what you are speaking of, Your Grace." "I believe you do," Gideon said, holding up a signed statement from Nolan Fitch, along with the payment records that confirmed his account. "Mr. Fitch has been quite forthcoming, once assured that honesty would serve him better than continued loyalty to you. He has confirmed, in writing, that you commissioned him to forge this letter, along with several of the accusations spread against Miss Merrick's family in recent weeks." Gasps rippled through the surrounding crowd. Georgiana, standing near her mother, had gone pale as parchment. "This is outrageous," Lady Sylvia began, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "You cannot possibly—" "I can, and I have," Gideon said. "I do not make accusations I cannot prove, Lady Sylvia. I have learned over the past several years the considerable difference between rumor and truth, and I have taken great care to ensure that what I present tonight is entirely the latter." The room had gone entirely silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding scene, and Adelaide, standing beside Gideon, felt none of the fear she had once associated with such scrutiny. For the first time in years, she stood at the center of a room's attention not as an object of pity, but as a woman claiming, openly and without apology, the life she wanted. "You have spent weeks attempting to destroy a woman whose only offense was refusing to disappear quietly," Gideon continued. "You spread false accusations about her father. You forged a letter in my hand to break her heart, and you did all of it because you could not accept that your own daughter's ambitions were not enough to secure my attention." He turned to look at Georgiana, whose expression had crumpled into something like shame. "I hold no ill will toward you, Miss Combe. I suspect you were as much a tool in this scheme as anyone, but your mother's cruelty ends tonight, in front of everyone who has ever whispered a word against Miss Merrick's character." Lady Sylvia opened her mouth to protest further, but found, looking around at the sea of shocked and disapproving faces, that she had no words left capable of salvaging the moment. She turned, without another word, and swept from the ballroom, Georgiana trailing behind her in silent mortification, and the whispers that followed them out the door carried an entirely different weight than the ones Lady Sylvia herself had once so carefully orchestrated. Adelaide watched them go, then turned to find Gideon watching her, and in his eyes she saw none of the coldness the ton had feared for 3 long years, only warmth and relief, and something that looked remarkably like hope. News of Lady Sylvia Combs' public disgrace spread through London faster than any rumor she had ever engineered herself, and within days the family had quietly withdrawn from society altogether, retreating to their country estate to wait out the scandal, in a silence considerably less comfortable than the one they had once inflicted on others. For Adelaide, the aftermath brought a strange and unfamiliar sensation, one she needed several days to properly identify. It was not relief exactly, nor triumph, though both were present in some measure. It was something closer to freedom, the sense that for the first time in a decade, she was no longer defined by whispers she could not control, or a reputation shaped entirely by other people's judgments. She found Gideon in the garden of Rothermere House on a bright, clear afternoon, standing among Rosamond's roses which had begun, under careful new attention, to bloom again after years of neglect. "You have been tending them," Adelaide said, joining him among the flowers. "I found, after everything that happened, that I could no longer bear to see them wither the way I once let them," Gideon said. It felt, somehow, like a small betrayal of her memory. "I have spent 3 years avoiding this garden entirely, unable to face what it represented. I find I no longer wish to avoid it. She would be glad to see them blooming again. I think she would be glad of a great many things, if she could see how far I have come since you sat beside me in that empty chair." Gideon turned to face her fully, something solemn and tender in his expression. "Adelaide, I have spent 3 years believing that closeness to another person was a risk I could no longer afford to take, that love only ever ended in loss too painful to survive twice. You have shown me, over these past weeks, that I was wrong. That the alternative, this careful guarded isolation I built for myself, was its own kind of loss, slower perhaps, but no less complete." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, and Adelaide felt her breath catch as he opened it to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, entirely unlike the ostentatious jewels favored by most of the ton. "I do not offer you a title merely for the sake of a title," Gideon said. "I offer you a life beside a man who has finally remembered what it feels like to hope for something. I love you, Adelaide Merrick. Not out of pity, not out of scandal, but because you looked at an empty chair everyone else feared and chose to sit down anyway. Will you marry me?" Adelaide's eyes filled with tears, though her smile remained steady. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, Gideon. I have spent a decade being avoided, and I find I would much rather spend the rest of my life being chosen instead." He slid the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands, and when he kissed her among his sister's roses, the garden seemed, for the first time in 3 years, entirely alive again. Their wedding, held some weeks later, was a modest affair by the standards of the ton, small and intimate rather than grand, held in the same garden where Gideon had proposed, surrounded by the roses that had once belonged to Rosamond, and now bloomed in full, glorious abundance around them both. Peter walked his sister down the garden path, his pride evident in every careful step, while Iris Bellamy watched from among the small gathering of guests with tears she made no effort to hide. Word of the wedding had spread quickly through London, and though many in society had once whispered cruelly about Adelaide's boldness in claiming the feared Duke's attention, those same voices now spoke, with considerably more admiration, of the quiet spinster who had thawed a heart everyone else had assumed frozen beyond repair. At the ball held that evening to celebrate their marriage, Gideon led Adelaide onto the dance floor for the first dance either of them had shared with anyone in years, and as they moved together beneath the same chandeliers where she had once dared to sit beside him in an empty chair, the entire room watched with open admiration rather than fear. Near the edge of the ballroom, where the empty chair had once stood as a symbol of everything Gideon's reputation had cost him, a new arrangement now stood instead. 2 chairs, placed deliberately side by side, neither of them empty, both of them claimed. "Do you remember," Adelaide murmured, as they danced, "how terrified the room seemed, that first night, when I sat beside you?" "I remember," Gideon said. "I have never forgotten a single moment of it. It was the beginning of everything, though I did not understand that yet." "And now?" "Now," Gideon said, drawing her closer as the music swelled around them. "There is no empty chair left in this house, nor in my life, for anyone to fear. You filled it, Adelaide, and in doing so, you filled everything else in me that I believed had been lost forever." Across the room, watching the newly married couple move together with an ease and warmth no one would have believed possible 3 years earlier, even the most hardened gossips of London found themselves, for once, with nothing unkind left to say. A year later, the gardens of Rothermere House bloomed more fully than they had in a decade, tended now with the same careful devotion Gideon had once reserved only for memory. Adelaide walked among the roses on a warm summer morning, one hand resting gently against the gentle curve of her stomach, where new life had begun to grow. Gideon found her there, as he often did, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against the top of her head. "You are thinking of her again," Adelaide said, without needing to ask. "Always, in this garden. But it is a gentler thought now than it once was. I think she would be glad, Adelaide, glad of the roses, glad of you, glad of the child we will welcome before winter arrives." He pressed a soft kiss to her hair. "I spent 3 years believing that love only led to loss, that closeness to another person was a wound waiting to happen. You taught me otherwise, simply by refusing to be afraid of an empty chair no one else would touch." Adelaide turned in his arms to face him, her smile soft and full of quiet contentment. "I did not sit beside you because I was brave, Gideon. I sat beside you because I understood what it meant to be avoided, and I could not bear to see another person carry that weight alone, not when I had spent so many years carrying it myself." "Whatever your reasons," Gideon said, "I will spend the rest of my life grateful for that single, quiet choice." He glanced around at the garden, full and blooming under the morning sun, then back at his wife, whose presence had transformed not only his house but the whole of his life. "There are no more empty chairs in Rothermere House, my love, only ones we have chosen to fill together." And as the roses swayed gently in the summer breeze, carrying with them the memory of a sister long gone and the promise of a child soon to arrive, the Duke of Rothermere, once the most feared man in London, stood in his garden with the quiet spinster who had dared to sit beside him, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely and completely at peace. That autumn, an invitation arrived at Rothermere House from a family Adelaide had once known only as distant, disinterested acquaintances, the kind of household that had never troubled itself to remember her name during the long years of her invisibility. The invitation was for a ball, the very same house where, years before, she had first taken the empty seat beside a man the whole of London feared. Adelaide dressed for the occasion with a quiet, steady confidence she would not have recognized in herself a year earlier. When she and Gideon entered the ballroom together, arm in arm, the room did not fall silent with shock, as it once had. Instead, heads turned with warmth, with curiosity, with the simple, ordinary interest people show toward a couple well loved by those around them. Near the far wall, where an empty chair had once stood as a monument to fear, Adelaide noticed only ordinary furniture now, filled and refilled throughout the evening by guests who thought nothing of where they chose to sit. She smiled at the sight of it, a private, satisfied smile that Gideon caught and returned without needing to ask its cause. "You are thinking of that first night," he said. "I am always thinking of it, in rooms like this," Adelaide admitted. "It feels, sometimes, as though it happened to two entirely different people." "In many ways I believe it did," Gideon said. "I was not the same man before you sat beside me, Adelaide. I do not think I could have become this version of myself without you." She squeezed his arm gently as the orchestra began a slow, familiar waltz, one they had come to think of, quietly, as their own. "Then let us dance," she said, "and give this room something far better to whisper about than either of us ever expected." They moved together onto the floor, and no one in the ballroom, watching the Duke and Duchess of Rothermere dance with an ease and devotion that had once seemed impossible for a man so many had feared, could have imagined the quiet, ordinary chair that had started it all. But Adelaide never forgot it, not truly. She carried the memory of that empty seat with her always, a small and private reminder that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply choose to sit down and stay.